This video is for Unit 2.1, an Introduction to Classification. So the first question I want to get into before we talk more about classification is, why do we care about this? Why do we have to put animals into groups and plants into groups and bacteria into groups and give them all these weird names that we use as scientific names for them? Well, first of all, when we put them into groups, we can really quickly see what similarities those organisms have. And if we know certain organisms are similar because they're in the same groups, then we know they have some sort of relatedness. And we'll get into that more when we talk about natural selection and evolution. The other important point I wanted to get to before we get into this topic is that this classification system that I'm going through today is very different from what it has been over the years. They change all the time based on our new technology. You can imagine when we discovered DNA and the implications that had for relatedness between species, that really changed our classification system. So like everything else in science, this is changing on a regular basis. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is the best that we can do right now with classification. In a few years, there might be some changes. All right, so first of all, in class today, I had you do a simple classification scheme of shoes. And what we did is we started with a broad category in that they were all shoes. And then from there, I had you further subdivide them into different categories. Now, I'm making this video before I actually know what categories you divided them into, but a possible first categorization for two different groups may have been our left shoes and our right shoes. Again, I don't know what you guys are going to end up doing, but this is an example. So we could further subdivide those shoes into left and right. Of all the left-footed shoes, we could divide them by color. So maybe we have our 4 different color choices for shoes that were within that left group. So maybe there was black, maybe there was white, maybe there was brown, and maybe someone was really crazy and had green shoes. And on the right-hand side, we could divide those by color as well. Black, white, brown, green. Then we could have taken each of those colors and further subdivided them by some sort of characteristic of those shoes. Maybe it was clean shoes versus dirty shoes. So we took all the black shoes and divided them into clean and dirty. I'll just shade in the dirty ones. And so forth and so on. Okay, I hope that you get the idea by doing this in class. But this classification scheme is very similar to what we use in biology to classify living organisms. So the whole idea of starting with a really broad category like shoes and breaking it down into more and more specific groups is called hierarchical classification. That means getting from broad to specific. Now, instead of the names of the groups being things like shoes and left and right shoes and colors of shoes, we use different names for our different groups in dividing up all the life on the planet. The biggest, broadest group, so just like our big shoes group, is kingdom. And I'll talk a little bit more about kingdoms in general in a little bit, but we divide all of life into 5 different kingdoms. So we'll do it this way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then of those 5 kingdoms, we're going to focus in on the animal kingdom, which we'll say is this one right here. And the animal kingdom, we're going to talk about how that can be divided into further little groups called phyla. Now, within other kingdoms, like for example the plant kingdom, they are also divided up into phyla. But we're not going to look as closely at those as we are the animal kingdom. And then the hierarchical classification continues. From phylum, we can further subdivide to class, further down into order, family, genus, and species being the most specific. So if we're going to rank these in their specificity, as we go down, the groups become more specific. And if you think back to the shoes, the smaller the groups we put the shoes into, the more specific we were about that shoe. Number 1, it was a shoe. Number 2, it was a left-footed shoe. Number 3, it was a black shoe. Number 4, it was a dirty shoe. So all of a sudden we have all these specific characteristics for this shoe. The same thing works for these hierarchical classifications. All right, let's look at humans as an example instead of shoes for a change. Let's ignore this domain for a minute because I haven't talked about that yet, and we'll just get back to that later. But we can start at number 1, our kingdom is animals. Number 2, our phylum for humans is chordates. In other words, we have a notochord, which is kind of like a spinal cord. Number 3, we are vertebrates. That's a subphylum. That is not an original hierarchical scheme, but you can have subphyla. They're just little smaller parts of phyla, but not as small as a class. 4th level specificity, the class we're in is we're all mammals. What type of mammals are we? Number 5, we are primates. Which group of primates are we? Number 6, we are great apes. And then specifically within the great ape family, what genus and species are we? The genus is Homo, the species is Sapiens. So it gets more and more specific, as you can see, as you go down. All right, now let's look specifically at these kingdoms and domains. So domain is our new word here first. So domain is even bigger than kingdoms, even broader. So instead of taking shoes as our biggest category, maybe the big category is footwear. And then down from footwear, we can further specify into shoes and so forth. So footwear would be our domain. So all of life on the planet is divided up into 3 domains. We have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Now eukarya all have a nucleus, and that is what makes them their own group. Just going to write in there, nucleus. The archaea and the bacteria have no nucleus, but they are distinct from each other, and that's why they are in 2 separate domains. Without getting too much into archaea, just so you know, these are tiny bacteria-like organisms, but they are different enough from bacteria that we put them into a separate group. The first archaea we found was fairly recently in the hot vents and like little mud pits and things in Yellowstone National Park. So they are extremophiles. In other words, they can survive at very extreme environments, temperatures and acidities and things like that. So we put them in their own little domain. Okay, now we're going to get more specific and work our way down to the kingdoms. So bacteria and archaea, they're their own domain and they are their own kingdom. So we don't divide bacteria up into different kingdoms within the bacteria domain, and the same for archaea. But the eukaryotes are different enough from each other that we do divide them up into 1, 2, 3, 4 different kingdoms. Okay, we have the protists, plantae, or plants, fungi, and animals. Animals and plants you're probably familiar with. Fungi are things like mushrooms and yeasts and things like that. Protists are single-celled creatures that have characteristics of both plants and animals. They can often swim around, but they have chloroplasts as well. So 4 kingdoms in the eukaryotic domain, and then bacteria and archaea are each their own domain and kingdom. From our hierarchical classification, we were able to develop something called binomial nomenclature, or the scientific names for all of the organisms on the planet. Now, the reason we call it something as funny sounding as binomial nomenclature is because every organism has a scientific name that's made of 2 parts, hence the bi in binomial. Bi is 2, nomial is name, and nomenclature means naming system. So it's a 2-name naming system. It was established way back in the 1700s by this guy named Linnaeus. He was a Dutch guy, I believe. No, Swedish guy. Really don't need to know that much about him except how this 2-word naming system actually works. So we take the 2 bottom most specific parts of our hierarchical classification, and that would be the genus and the species, and we use those for making those names. So the first word, for example, in Homo sapiens, our genus, as I said earlier, is Homo. That one is always capitalized and then underlined or in italics. The second word in a scientific name is the species, So for humans, again, sapiens. That one is always lowercase, but also underlined or italicized. So the scientific name of any organism gives us a clue to its classification as well and what it's related to. Now, before I forget, I want to make sure that I give you a little key to remember this order of the hierarchical classification before we move on. So remember, the order was kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, I'll tell you a secret. I don't have that memorized. Instead, I have a mnemonic device to help me remember it. So I wanted to share that with you so you can remember the order as well. K is for kings. P is for play. C is for chess. O is for on. F is for fuzzy. G is for green. And S is for stools. So the mnemonic device to remember the order is kings play chess on fuzzy green stools. That one seems to help me. There are other ones out there too. You could always make up your own as well. The last part of this video, I want to get into what you're going to be doing in your lab so you have a little heads up as to what's going to happen. So in the lab that you're doing in class, which will take a few days, you're going to look at a variety of different animals from different phyla. And you're going to use something called the dichotomous key to help identify them. And in class, you did a little practice with those weird-looking alien things that had the friends and the bristles and all those crazy structures. That was using a dichotomous key. You're going to do the same thing with this animal classification to figure out what the names of these different phyla are. So, given the key, you're first going to use the key and the animal to find the classification characteristics. And you're going to list them out step by step, just like you did with the practice in class with the crazy alien thing. Then you're going to figure out, as I said, what the name of that is, and then give a label at the top of your drawing of that particular organism. Now the drawing itself is going to be in an index card, so you're going to trace out one index card, split it in half, and in that half you're going to do one drawing, and in the other half you're going to do a second drawing. So every index card will actually get you 2 different animals completed. Your label, besides having the name, should also have the letter of the organism, so that I know you've identified the correct letter as the correct phylum. And then when everything is said and done, when you've got your classification characteristics, you've got a label with a name and letter, you've got a nice drawing with notes, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. Then you're going to go to your textbook and you're going to find 3 other examples of organisms that fit into that phylum, so that fit with that name that you found. So to make this a little more clear, I took a pretend organism and did an example. So let's say I was presented with this organism. I drew it out. Might look like something familiar to you. I used my dichotomous key to write out the steps that it took to get to that name. Notice the steps don't necessarily go 1, 2, 3, 4, because remember, in a dichotomous key sometimes you skip around. So there's your key steps with the descriptions written out. Once I got to the end, I found that the name of this phylum was arthropod, and the letter, let's say for this one, was letter B. On my drawing, I made sure to label any parts that maybe weren't clear from my drawing. I'm not a beautiful artist. Obviously, I didn't draw this one. This one's pretty well done. But maybe it would be easier to label those sections that you can't tell what they are. So every picture should have at least one label on it. And then finally, you go into your textbook and find examples of other organisms that are also arthropods. This is a picture of a crab. Other arthropods are lobsters, spiders, and shrimp. I'll go over these again when we have class, but I think it'll be easier that you've had it already, and if you have any questions, make sure you bring those along. Don't forget to fill out the form with the feedback and the questions when you're done with this, so that I can see if you're having trouble with any of the areas that I've discussed.